Good afternoon. This is Ask the JDK Architects. We have some JDK architects here, and you get to ask some questions. Quick introductions. There's a hand mic. Go ahead, Alan or Robert, whoever's first.
Alan Bateman.
No.
Is this on?
Yes.
Aha, great. Alan Bateman here. Not an architect, just happened to be at Devoxx.
You're an architect.
I'm a doctor, not an architect, damn it. I'm Stuart Marks, otherwise known as Dr. Deprecator.
I'm Robert Field, currently working on JShell.
Okay. So the algorithm. Oh, right. So sorry. I'm going to show you the shortest possible presentation you will ever see from an Oracle employee. This is slide number 1. Whoops. Go back. Stop. That's slide number 2. All right, we've got that out of the way. We go back to slide number 1. So Q&A here. There's a microphone up there. There's a microphone that we can pass around also. You can also ask questions on Twitter by using the hashtag JDKArch, or Arch, however you prefer to pronounce it. And assuming that the Wi-Fi stays up, this will work. So, who's first? Kirk? Kirk doesn't have a question.
Okay. While we're waiting here, Stuart and I were discussing which collection form. While we were waiting here, we were deciding what collection type we would actually use to exclude certain rows. I was proposing a bit set, and row 3 was set.
And given the number of people we want to exclude questions from, that is all the hecklers in the audience, I was proposing using jumbo enum set.
Richard, why don't you one of you do it, because I have a mic.
I'm sorry, what?
Please take the microphone to Dr. Warburton. Sometimes doctors are just...
Hi, thanks. Since no one else is asking questions, there was a serialization vulnerability that cropped up last week. There were any plans to change anything JDK-wise in response to this vulnerability? Obviously, the vulnerability itself relies on a whole part of third-party code also doing stupid things. So it's not necessarily a JDK-specific vulnerability, but there are some things that could happen that could be changed in the JDK that mean that if people do have stupid code, it wouldn't be a massive security vulnerability.
Excellent question. So we've decided we're just going to remove serialization from 9. And 8 and 7.
What's the JEP number?
What's the JEP number? Just kidding, I wish.
I was not kidding, there is a JEP.
I know there's a JEP, but you withdrew it.
I withdrew it.
It was filed on, I believe, April 1st, a couple of years ago. As much as we would like to remove serialization, that doesn't really seem to be very practical. We have looked at ways to make it more difficult to make stupid mistakes. And some of those enhancements might be in 9 or might be on the way to 9. Alan is probably closer to them.
So there has been an effort. If anyone's on the OpenJDK core libs dev, you'll see several efforts over. If anyone's on core libs dev, you'll see over the last year many efforts to try to improve serialization. Some of those efforts have come to a halt for compatibility reasons. This is the big problem with serialization, is it ties your hands and feet, and it's really, really hard to make progress. But there has been a couple of things, particularly the work that Chris Hegarty and Peter Levert have done to put in things like a final fence and a few other things that have improved the reliability of serialization. On Richard's specific question as to whether there's anything in the JDK vulnerable or other related products, we're not allowed to talk about any of that kind of stuff. As to whether there's other things that could be done to serialization that would make it easier, make libraries less prone to some of these, then if you have specific proposals, bring them up. There is a bucket of serialization issues on the table to be looked at. They're just really, really hard, because anytime we attempt to change anything in serialization, it breaks something.
There's a question up there. It would be more efficient if you could walk up to the microphone that's back there in the aisle. And bear in mind that it's very difficult for us to see you.
Actually, with them up there, they could really do a Manfred Man, blinded by the light.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are Jigsaw-related questions allowed?
No.
Okay.
Come on, of course they're allowed.
One of the most annoying things about OSGI is the need to specify imports and exports in the manifest, making it impossible for normal jars to be used in OSGI. I was hoping that Jigsaw would resolve that, but now it seems that the version range will not be supported in the module info. And I was wondering if it was considered to support the definition of the required version range without doing the whole resolution of the modules. I'm not sure if that question is clear. But
So I think you're asking yet another version, so to speak, of the most frequently asked question about Jigsaw, which is why there aren't version constraints in modulinfo.java files. Would that be roughly right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the answer is we did a first prototype of Jigsaw that had version constraints in modulinfo.java files, and we implemented a bunch of the usual heuristics for doing version selection, interpreting the constraints, dealing with conflicts, and so forth. It wasn't very satisfactory. We were on the verge of integrating a thing called a SAT solver, a Boolean satisfiability solver, which is a very sophisticated set of heuristics for solving problems of that form that can often generate optimal or near optimal results. But then we stepped back and looked at the complexity of the thing we were about to build. We considered, well, how is that going to fit in with existing build tools like Maven and Gradle and Ivy? And we realized, well, we would be doing one kind of resolution and version selection. Maven would be doing another kind. Gradle would be doing another kind. Does it really make sense for the module system to be doing version selection, dependency, conflict management, and all of that really hard stuff that build tools have already attacked? So we decided, and I realize this is counterintuitive to many people. It was counterintuitive to us at first, but we eventually became comfortable with it. We decided, well, let's just not do version selection in the module system. It's the responsibility of build tools and container apps and things around the platform to put the right artifacts on the module path so that what the module system sees is at most one version of any particular module. And that way it's just very simple. The resolution algorithm in Jigsaw is almost trivial. It's a transitive closure computation.
Yeah, but that was actually the question. So I'm not asking to do the selection, but to verify that those modules that are available are
match the constraints given.
Yeah.
So that is a middle ground that we have considered, but I think our view is that. So one part of our view is that version constraints just really don't belong in source code. They're more properly the domain of build systems. I think there is the possibility, and you're not the first person to suggest this, and we had thought of it before. Well, perhaps the model system, the resolution algorithm itself shouldn't change, but if there are constraints in a module expressed somehow, it should at least check them. And if they don't hold true, then it would just fail. I think that may be worth exploring, but the version constraints, they wouldn't be in the source code. As version strings can be added when you package up a module, perhaps you could add the constraints at that time too. and then the model system could validate them later on. So that's something worth considering, and we'll think about it.
Back up here.
There is a microphone just a couple of rows back. It would make it more efficient.
Yes,
if you could use
I
that.
want Alan to lose some weight now, running up and down.
Well, we've already done several Jigsaw talks, and Mark ran around with the microphone. He's looking very fit.
Yeah.
It's the Stefan Janssen weight loss plan.
Right. So we are still on Java 7. So, you know.
Could be worse.
Yeah. Okay. So fact is we are. You know, we would love to be at 8 at the moment, but we are not. And one of the main initiatives we are doing right now is trying to split up our monolithic applications into modules.
We're familiar with this problem.
Yeah. And how we are doing this is by creating two separate modules, like an API module which exposes the interface, and then the module which has the code. And it's exactly what you're doing in 9, in a way, in the Jigsaw, trying to solve the Jigsaw puzzle. Not exactly, but
No,
something on those lines. My question is, we have one of our tasks or priorities next year is to shift to Java 8. Do you think we should do that or skip that and consider adopting Java 9 when it is released? I don't know when, but do you think it would be somewhat of a wasted effort to continue our modularization initiative on Java 7 and move to Java 8 in the short term, or just wait for Java 9?
Personally, I would get off 7 as fast as I can. I mean, 8 has so much good stuff in it, Lambda and streams and everything else. It's a good place to be. Oh, and it's faster too. So, I would move forward independently of any kind of pre-modularization cleanup effort. But you know, I understand it can be a difficult thing to do in a large production environment. Twitter questions. Where'd my search go? Any news on value types? Will we see them anytime soon? Oh, they're in 8. You didn't see them? Oh, sorry. No, they're not in 8, and they will not be in 9. So value types are being worked on by Brian Getz and many other people in Project Valhalla in OpenJDK. It's a pretty tough problem. They've produced a couple rounds of prototypes. They've dug into lots of really complex issues. So that work is ongoing. It is not slated for 9. I would say I hope to see it in a release after 9, so no earlier than 10. But beyond that, you know, it's software. There's a question.
Are there any plans to remove the current way of working with the class paths in the future?
Yeah, we're going to take the class path out completely.
By when?
I'm kidding. Yeah. Sorry. It's been a long couple of days. No. So if you have an application today that runs on 7 or 8 and it only uses standard or supported APIs, then it must run on 9. That's not a goal. That's a constraint. If it uses some unsupported internal APIs, well, it might run on 9 and it might not. But you're already playing with fire on 7 and 8 if you're doing that. So no, the class path will be with Java probably forever. So there it is.
Here.
Wherever.
We've got the version selection problem again.
Yeah.
You come up.
Questions about JShell for Robert? Questions about deprecation for the doctor?
It's me. Yeah, I got a totally different kind of question. I can notice in our company that more and more we are putting JavaScript frameworks instead of J2E frameworks or those kind of things. I also hear in the conference there's more and more JavaScript frameworks. What's your, as experts, opinion about JavaScript? Is it a threat for Java? And if not, why not actually?
Is JavaScript a threat to Java?
I really have no opinion about
Well,
this. I just ask.
JavaScript is to Java as car is to carpet. It's a different language. It has a few advantages. In my view, it has lots of disadvantages. For some scenarios, it's a better tool. That's okay. I mean, that's one reason why we invested in putting Nashorn into JDK 8. So they can work well together. Is JavaScript a threat to Java? I don't know.
Answer is no.
I mean, if you can replace a big Java EE application with a couple thousand lines of JavaScript running on Node on a smaller machine, well, yeah, go for it. Duh. But does that mean that Java is on the way to becoming COBOL? No, I don't think so. There's still plenty of other areas where Java is going to do way better. I mean, in general, one of the things I hear from people who work in production environments a lot is Node gets to be pretty painful to deploy at scale because you basically need one instance per core, or per thread on the core, because that's just how it works. It's not. It's not multi-threaded, and sure there's the whole async programming model, but that's burdensome too, with basically every statement having to do a continuation pass to the next one, and you need a very wide screen because you're indenting and indenting and indenting all these functions that are calling back to each other. Anyway.
Thanks.
Random riff. Would you like to deprecate JavaScript?
Hello. I didn't have a look into Jigsaw, so maybe it's a very basic question. But when you build some artifact that you want to deliver, will it then be an executable or still a jar file that runs into an external JVM, or is it? I don't know. Do the executables contain the JVM and it are just exe files, or how will it look like?
So what we're planning to provide is this linking tool, so you can link a bunch of modules together and get a custom runtime image. It looks like a JDK, but with a bunch of stuff taken out. So it has native code in it. It has a launcher in it, even a launcher specific to your app. So you can do it that way. But once you've got this, it's not just one executable file. It's a directory with a bin. It's a directory with a bin subdirectory and a lib subdirectory, and so on and so forth. You can then, if you want, package that up into something that you, for example, ship off to the Mac App Store or a Windows app repository, and perhaps it's delivered as one executable. But that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. There's a related tool in the JDK called the Java Packager, which it already exists in JDK 8. In 9, that's going to be enhanced, so it'll be a front end for JLink. It will use JLink to make a custom image, and then it also handles the additional work of bundling the result of that up, so that you can deploy to an app store. But one could imagine other kinds of deliverables, and in fact, JLink has a plugin API. One could, in theory, write a JLink backend that took everything and magically put it into one exe file that you could then deploy. We don't plan to write that, but someone could.
Java X does that,
Well,
doesn't it?
the packager will do some form of that. I'm not familiar with the details.
It's all changed now to work as a JLink plugin and does all the stripping that gets you the package application as it was before. But to the person that just asked the question, I think part of your question might not have been about JLink. It might have been just about converting libraries into modules and how they might be packaged. So if you download the Jigsaw builds, you can actually try out everything there. There's a quick start to get you going, including some basic instructions with JLink to try that as well.
I have a somewhat specific question. With all the dependency control between modules, also dependencies within a module between the packages is sometimes very interesting. And we try to build a tool that checks dependencies between packages using JDepend. And we try to do that with annotation on the package info. And we can't provide a literal for the package that we depend on. We have to pick a class within a package. It would just be nice to have the possibility to use a package literal, something like foo_bar.package, and have that in an annotation so I can scan the dependencies that are allowed or not allowed.
That's a request I've never heard before.
I thought so.
So this would be akin to being able to say foo.class. You can say foo.bar.package. And you need this so that annotations can mention other packages?
Exactly.
Okay. And and annotations need to mention other packages so that you can track how packages depend upon one another? Okay. And strings won't cut it for you?
No refactoring.
No refactoring.
No type safety.
Yeah. I can see the need that you have. I think before putting something like that in the language, we would need a lot more use cases. A tool that interpreted your annotations and treated strings as package names appropriately wouldn't be that hard to write. I realize it's not as clean.
I would have to load the packages if I have the class.
And yes, you would. Yes, you would have to load the packages. That's true. I think the word niche is relevant here.
So you can do static analysis of everything that's in the library of the jar file without actually using any annotations, right?
Yeah. Well, the JDEPS tool will also analyze cross-package connections.
Ah, there is someone.
Oh, excellent.
Is it on?
Apparently.
Oh, cool. So I have a question about nested callbacks in asynchronous code. You mentioned them briefly in one of the...
Actually, sorry, I don't think it is on. And our sound person left.
I can yell really loud. I have a question about asynchronous callbacks and the nested callbacks that you get with heavily asynchronous code. There is a syntax that originally came from C# and it's now in a couple of languages, including ECMAScript 6 for asynchronous code, which is async await. And I'm wondering if something like that would be considered for Java as well.
Long-term, perhaps. One of the things I think is important to look at post-9 is better support for asynchronous programming. In particular, some form of continuations built into the VM would be a pretty powerful tool. It would let us do much lighter weight threads, and in fact would allow you to write straight line code that that would have the same efficiency as code that does explicitly asynchronous operations. If we get that far, then having an async wait is not necessarily that useful. But if we decide that continuations are just a non-starter, then maybe we should look at async.await. So, yeah, maybe, but not in 9, and yeah, maybe not in 10. Probably not in 10, but don't
good to hear you're
thinking
thinking about it at least.
Oh yeah, no, the whole asynchronous thing is really important.
Another question here.
Let me do a couple questions on Twitter so that some of the rest of us can answer questions. Alan, could you bring the mic back down here? Sorry. Can you add external jars to the class path of a JShell and use them in a snippet?
Yes. There's a / Classpath command that allows you to specify any external jars, class files, anything you put on the class path, you can reference from the JShell.
Robert flew thousands of miles to answer that one question.
You run for a while.
Well, actually, leave it here for a moment. A question for Dr. Deprecator, which he actually answered yesterday in a different session. Will the old date and time API be deprecated in JDK 9 and eventually, hopefully, removed in JDK 11 or later?
Okay, well, now that we have the Java time API introduced in 8, then it's probably time to deprecate all the rest of Java util date and calendar. But removing is quite a different deal, right? So deprecation, the way I think of deprecation is it's a way to signal to programmers that they need to migrate their code away, or that they ought to migrate their code away from what's being deprecated. And so in this case, there's a clear replacement. If you have some code that uses date or calendar, then you should migrate to java.time. But what we don't want to do is take that stuff away too soon, because then that makes that forces it. It's a little easy for us to say, oh, it forces people to migrate their code, but actually it doesn't. What it does is it stops them from migrating to JDKs. So what we want to do is enable people to migrate the code from the old APIs to the new APIs on their own terms. So the only things that we are seriously considering removing are things that are so dangerous that there's no possible way you can use them correctly, or things that really are just useless and simply don't belong in the platform anymore, that nobody's using anyway. And so there are relatively few examples of that. But things that are old and outdated and have been superseded, generally we're not going to take them away after one release or something like that, because there's too much existing code that depends on them, and it would just cause too much of a disruption to remove them on even a fairly, even on a couple JDK release notices, or notice of a couple JDK releases.
Yeah. And what? Java.io.file.
You want to answer that?
So we looked at deprecating this some time ago, but decided it wasn't sufficiently evil to deprecate it. There are many things broken in Java.io file. There's many of the methods. You'll remember we put in a whole bunch of Javadoc to forward them to the new NIO file system so that where the methods and the APIs do the right thing. But I have not had any discussion recently anyway about deprecating anything in Java.io file. There's certainly things that are really broken, but I most certainly wouldn't get to removing them like the old date and time API.
Yeah, probably ever. But speaking of that, if we had multiple ways to deprecate things, we might deprecate Java.io file in a gentler way than just saying don't use this. Perhaps Dr. Deprecator would care to elaborate.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things about there's a deprecation JEP currently posted. JEP 277, if I recall correctly, but basically it proposes a number of enhancements to the deprecation mechanism. And one of the problems with the existing deprecation mechanism, as it were, is it's a single annotation that says deprecated, and there's a lot of confusion about what that means. And so earlier, or a moment ago, I said, well, to me, deprecation means programmers should migrate their code away. But one of the problems with the existing deprecation or deprecated annotation is it's not clear. I mean, that's one possible interpretation. Or another possible interpretation is that this is really going to be removed. And so the deprecation enhancement will provide finer-grained information about why something has been deprecated and what action programmers should take in response to something being deprecated, as well as a disposition of, yes, we really do intend to remove something, or no, this is merely an advisory that causes warnings to be issued to tell programmers to migrate their code away, but not a threat of imminent removal. Yes. So Remy says he wants a warning at runtime. Yes, that's an excellent idea, and that's something we're looking at adding, because the current deprecation mechanism only issues warnings at compile time. And so if you have an old binary, and so since we have binary compatibility, if you have an old binary and you run it on a new JDK that has deprecated some things, you don't see a warning. So that is an issue, and so yes, so having a runtime warning mechanism for deprecation is definitely in the cards.
Just one little thing about runtime warnings is they can be disruptive to anywhere that does logging or does parses the output of some program. Often gets confused by warning messages, so we have to be really, really careful about doing warnings at runtime. It can't always be something that's enabled by default.
Yeah, we've done that very rarely.
We've been burnt many times on this.
Yeah, it would definitely be opt-in. It wouldn't be. It wouldn't have deprecation warnings by default.
And you wouldn't need language support, would you? Deprecated annotation is runtime available.
The deprecated annotation is preserved at runtime. So any tool can look at it, write interceptors, whatever. Yeah, that's true. But if you want the VM to issue warnings when a deprecated method is invoked, then the VM needs to interpret the annotation, right? Because a static analysis of deprecated annotations will not discover all uses of the deprecated method, right? There are always limits to what you can do with static analysis.
Yeah, I think if I understand what Remy's suggesting is you run Java with some mode, and if it loads something that is deprecated, would emit a warning that you can then use that to bug whoever owns that code to move it to whatever the newer API is. If I understand what you're asking, Remy.
Okay, another question from Twitter. Reporting an issue on OpenJDK's Jira is hard because getting an account is difficult. Are there any plans to make that easier? Yes, we've been thinking about this for a while. When we established the JDK bug system in OpenJDK, we made an explicit decision not to have it open to the world, and well, not open to the world for writing. This was based in part on fairly painful experience we had at Sun. Anybody remember the old Sun bug parade? You could go to bugs.sun.com and anybody could add comments to a bug report. And let's just say the signal to noise ratio was extremely poor. And if you look at other open source bug systems, for example, Mozilla, you see a similar thing. There is just tons and tons of noise. You're just people coming in doing, drive-by shootings of, this bug is stupid or that fix was wrong, but not telling you why, just whining. And when a lot of your life as a developer working on the JDK is centered around the bug system, this just makes things harder. So I doubt we will ever open it up for just arbitrary people to come in and sign up, get an account so that they can add their own particular value or pollution to the bug database. But we've heard this request before. We've been pondering, well, maybe there should be a way for people who submit bugs through through the slow path through it's now bugs.java.com. You do that through the slow path a few times and establish yourself as, yes, you actually have a reputation for submitting good bug reports, then we'll give you a Jira account and you can create them directly and comment on other ones. And it's kind of the usual sort of community model where you demonstrate that you can do well, and then we give you more privileges accordingly. So that's something that the OpenJDK Governing Board has discussed, and I can't promise when we'll do it, but I imagine we'll get there in some reasonable time frame.
So on the subject of bugs.java.com, that is the supported way for the general public to file bugs against Java. And there are some problems with it. People who've tried that experience issues. I think the main issue is once you submit it, you get some number that you can't do anything with, and basically your bug drops into a black hole. And so we are working on some things. We have an internal workflow where we have some staff who are vetting those incoming bug reports and then transferring them into the main Jira database. And so another thing we're working on is once that process is streamlined, then the original submitter should get notified, okay, your bug has been processed and now has this bug ID in Jira, JDK 819235. And so that, I think, would close the loop for a lot of things. So people would see, oh, yes, I submitted a bug report, and there it is in the database. And then there are also ways, even if you don't have an account, to get like an RSS feed of changes to a bug. So we're slowly working on improving that. So even if you don't eventually get a Jira account, there's still ways you can get better visibility into bug reporting, and we're still working on those.
Thank you. Question here?
Thank you. So in the context of Project Jigsaw, does it make sense to still talk about JSE, JME, GE? Since you can build basically...
Java EE and Java ME?
Yeah. And the second question...
Sorry, one at a time.
Okay.
Sure, it totally makes sense to keep talking about Java ME and Java EE as separate things. Our hope and expectation, and we've already been working with some of the EE spec leads, is that a future version of EE, perhaps with the version number 9, will integrate the modules feature, and you'll be able to have a WAR file that's a module, or a WAR file that contains module, an EAR file that contains modules, and app servers that have modules, and do all the right thing with them, and get all the benefits of modules. But EE itself, I expect will continue to be an assemblage of web and enterprise technologies that aren't appropriate for SE that constitute a larger platform built on top of it. Java ME is becoming more specialized for smaller devices. Java ME CDC is essentially being replaced by SE, and that is one of the those sort of second level goals of all this modularization work, so that you can use a subset of SE9 or JDK9 where today you would use CDC. It is not in the cards to replace CLDC, the smaller variant of Java ME, with any of what we're doing with Jigsaw. That was something we pondered in the very early days when we started this work in 2008, but it's just infeasible to slice and dice the JDK down to the sizes required for CLDC applications when you're talking about a couple hundred kilobytes. We can't go that far. If we were starting over from scratch, and perhaps we could design a system whose smallest, where the Javadoc based module really was a couple hundred kilobytes, and you have some tiny VM that would work in that environment. But for better or for worse, ME forked from SE a long time ago, and CLDC has remained for very, very small application scenarios, and I don't see how to unify them at this late stage.
Thank you. And I had a second question in the context of deprecation. I understand that you will not remove features from Java very soon, but do you envision a time where the technical debt is too much and then you have to have a version of Java that's not backwards compatible? Say version 15, you say you're still using vectors, tough luck.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't know. I mean, Vector is sort of the whipping boy, because I gave a talk at Java 1, which talked a lot about Vector and did some poking of fun at it and stuff. But I don't know whether. Well, so you raise an interesting question of technical debt, and as far as I can see, vector is its own thing, it has its own issues, but it doesn't actually affect the rest of the system. And there are a bunch of things that fall into that category. And so it doesn't benefit the platform enough to offset the cost and disruption of removing them. So probably fine-grained things like that will probably just sit there. But there are other things that we would like to turn our eye towards that would simplify the JDK. And so the first thing that comes to mind is Corba. So Corba is part of every JDK right now, and only probably an increasingly small subset of applications use Corba. And so at some point we'd like to make that optional and kind of detach it from the core JDK, and maybe even when we get to the point of being able to deprecate modules, deprecate that and say, okay, time to migrate to something else. This is going to be removed from the JDK. So I think
it is not a coincidence that in Jigsaw, Corba is its own module and nothing depends on it.
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, so there are larger scale things like that in the JDK where we can, if we split things across module boundaries in a reasonable way, then we can deprecate them and detach them, and then simplify the system that way. Whereas things like vector and hash table and observable, it's like, yeah, they're probably just going to sit there.
Thank you very much. But it still might be worth putting a weak deprecation tag on them. Deprecated, inadvisable, or denigrated, or something like that.
Well, I think the word I've been using for that is superseded. So clearly those things have been superseded by newer APIs. So the advisory there is for applications, or for developers to migrate their applications to use newer APIs. But that's different from the other word we've been using is condemned, to mean this is going to be removed. And so I doubt that those finer grained APIs, as obsolete as they are, will actually be removed.
Thank you. This last part of the conversation actually has just ruined my plan to add system.getOrb.
Another question for Stuart. Any progress toward programmatically created immutable collections?
Programmatically created immutable collections. Okay, so quick recap. I gave a talk yesterday on a new set of collection APIs, which are static factory methods that produce immutable collections for list, set, and map. So those are currently aimed at solving the collection literal problem. So the primary use case is listing a set of values that are known at compile time. So you can just type those directly into your source code. Now, there is certainly a use case for the result of some computation to result in an aggregation of values that you eventually want to put into an immutable collection. And so we support that only kind of indirectly and not very well, which is you have to accumulate them into an array and then call one of the array or varargs consuming factory methods to do that. And I realize that's inconvenient, but if you look at the number of different use cases where you might be computing something, well, then it opens up the problem quite a bit more. So you might say, well, should you take a collection? Should you take an array? Should you take something with a functional transform or something? And well, really what you want to do, I think, is create a collector that you can put on the end of a stream that will collect into an immutable collection. And I think that's a fine idea, but just sort of in terms of keeping the proposal minimal, we've decided to factor that out initially. One of the issues is that in that collector, the collector interface is not actually rich enough to do that efficiently because size information does not get propagated to the collector. So that's something we've talked about on and off internally. When we enhance I think it's something we'll continue to look at, but that's not going to be it's probably not going to be in the initial version of the collections APIs in 9.
Yeah, I do think longer term, and this is again longer term, peering into the future, post 9 or well post 9. I wouldn't be surprised eventually to see an immutable collections API in Java. we've been following the work done in systems like Clojure and some of the Scala work on immutable collections. Some of those algorithms are really interesting. They don't seem quite advanced enough yet in terms of performance and ease of use to fold into Java, but I think there probably is a case to be made in a few years' time for true immutable collections in Java with, in the style that you find in Clojure. But that's that's looking at a crystal ball. It's certainly not a promise. Well, hang on. That mic's not on.
Why not just
sorry,
allow
just wait, please. That microphone is off, and we don't know how to turn it on.
I would have been okay. Yes. Why not just accept a collection instead of an array as an additional API method?
Mics would have been good.
Yeah.
Well, basically, we wanted to keep the API simple and focused on solving the collection literal problem. I think taking a collection is kind of an obvious extension, but if you do that, then so why did you do this instead? Well, we could add this. Oh, we should add that instead. I think I can. I think you probably have a bunch of good ideas. I have a bunch of good ideas about things I could add, but in order to get something into the JDK successfully, we just have to cut it off at some point and say, okay, here's a minimal API that satisfies a certain set of use cases fairly well, and then run with that. I think that's quite a likely possibility for a future extension, is to have something that takes a collection instead of an array.
Question from Twitter: any progress towards operator notation for numeric operations on non-primitive numeric types? So we're kind of running up against this in Valhalla. If you can define a value class that could be used for, say, a 128-bit integer or some big decimal type that's represented in a very compact fashion, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to be able to write x plus y instead of x.add of y? Java is famous for avoiding operator overloading intentionally in the very early days, and we've stuck with that. Avoiding custom operator definitions. But yeah, maybe user-defined operators are something that are worth looking at in the context of value types. But if we do that, I suspect they will be limited. We do not want to see the kind of abuse of random symbols that you find in languages like C++. Or I should say, libraries associated with C++. C++ itself, as a language, doesn't necessarily abuse them. The questions in the room? Gentleman there.
Thank you. Javadoc has been quite stable over time, and I find it quite useful to have documentation close to the Java source, at least some technical documentation. But it's not very, well, it doesn't have a lot of features, and because of that, for example, in our company, we are more creating documentation outside of source code, and I have a question whether you're gonna evolve somehow Javadoc, or
are we going to evolve Javadoc? Well, it's certainly evolving in 9. So Javadoc is becoming aware of modules, and its output is now structured so that you can look at just the packages in a module and select that way. And the page for any given class tells you not only what package that class is in, but what module it's in. Thank you, Javadoc search. We've implemented a JavaScript search function. So if you download the pile of Javadoc HTML for a release onto your local machine, view it in your browser, there's a search box, and so you can search around using that. Deeper enhancements. So I have a patch on my laptop that allows me to write Javadoc comments not in HTML combined with these funny at tags, but in Markdown. Markdown, ASCII doc, whatever. Yeah, it would be nice to have a more modern markup language than HTML and inline at tags. There's just a patch on my laptop. You know, it was mostly a proof of concept. You know, it works kind of okay. It's certainly not slated for any particular release at the moment. But as someone who writes a lot of Javadoc, I would dearly love to see a better markup language. I think that would be a huge improvement. I don't know if you had other kinds of improvements in mind, or.
The current state of Javadoc is just not enough to write our technical documentation in the source code. I don't know, maybe to have the possibility to collect the documentation not only on the method level, but inside the source code as well. Maybe to have additional files. Something. I don't know.
Well, Javadoc can already support additional files. They'll get copied over, and if you know, it doesn't take much to create links to them. Going into the source code, that seems kind of outside the domain of Javadoc as it's presently conceived. But you know, one could hack the standard doclet to make it do that. Why not? Impl note, sure. We can come back to it.
Thank you. Can you tell me how the modules for the UI toolkits in Java will be cutted?
Yes, there's one module. It's called Java.desktop. There's another collection of modules whose names begin with Java.fx. I think there are 7 of them. And yes, WebKit is in its own module. So for Swing, AWT, and 2D, as we were slicing through the bowl of spaghetti trying to clean things up over the years, it proved just too difficult to try to disentangle them. They really are one large subsystem. So Java.desktop is all of Swing and AWT plus some Beans utilities things and data transfers. Or no, data transfer is its own module.
Data transfer is refactored out.
You know, FX being a newer system with a fundamentally better architecture was less difficult to modularize, and we worked with the FX team to create a nice set of FX modules. So depending on what you need, you can choose all of them or just a couple of them. And if you want to leave out WebKit, which is gargantuan, then you can do that.
And if you tried the Jigsaw early access build, the FX modules are already linked into that.
Yeah.
And I think we want to come back to the Javadoc and just talk about the tags.
Sure.
Yeah, so back to the Javadoc topic. So there's a small feature that crept into Java 8, which is, you may have noticed if you looked carefully that there's these new sections in method documentation like API note, implementation specification, and implementation note. Without going into too many details, there was this problem in the previous Javadoc version, which was if you had subclasses, they could either inherit the entire, an overriding method could either inherit all of the documentation of the method of its superclass or none of it. And so since often a subclass would want to inherit part of the specification, like the contract part, but separately talk about a different implementation that it had, this ended up causing documentation to be copied all over the place. And so these tags are first attempt at trying to separate that out. In particular, separating implementation documentation, or actually the implementation specification, from API specification. And I think the forcing function for this was the addition of default methods, where we needed to specify that this default method actually had this behavior that subclasses can rely on, but that would not be inherited by things that overrode it. So I don't know if that counts as a Javadoc enhancement, but it's something that in looking at the existing way that Javadoc interacted with the object system and inheritance of Java, the programming language. There was this mismatch, and so that's what we added to try to solve that. And I think it helps a little bit.
From Twitter, is it possible in the future that the module java.base will be split itself into modules? Well, that would be awkward. What would we name them? Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Is it likely? Probably not.
If you start in Java lang object and you do all the transitive closure, you actually end up with, and do not do any splitting of packages, then you end up with almost exactly what Java base is now.
Yeah, we think it's pretty much as small as it can be on a practical basis. Further change would be a different platform.
Right. The only thing that can be taken out without splitting packages is actually the APIs related to TLS, but they're so useful and so tied to applications that's the reason that's in the base module.
Yeah.
I can do it.
So, Mark, I think you mentioned in the session on Tuesday that part of the moduling system was to improve uptime, improve the startup time for JVMs, and I didn't really get how this happens. Is it because there are fewer dependencies now, or if you could elaborate on that, please?
So, startup time in Jigsaw is actually worse at the moment, but we're working on it. When you have to do resolution and read in module info class files and all that, there's more work to do. But we have some work in progress that will get us back closer to JDK 8 level startup times. In terms of improving startup performance, there are a couple things. There are things that we will do as part of Jigsaw in 9 that will help, or we've already done. For example, moving away from rt.jar, insofar as an application can move away from the slow linear search of the class path, we have this very efficient internal format for modules that has replaced rt.jar. It does not involve linear search. It's very fast, and that's helpful. Some optimization plugins that we expect, not necessarily promise, to ship in 9 are for example, a pre-verification plugin that would run the bytecode verifier on your class files as part of making a custom image, so that the bytecode verifier would not have to run at startup. And the bytecode verification for a large application can actually be quite significant. We're looking at something like NetBeans that's going to load thousands and thousands of classes just to paint the first UI screen. That can be a significant improvement. Longer term, we're attempting to enable other kinds of optimizations that will either be additional kinds of plugins to the linker, or perhaps entirely other tools, things like ahead of time compilation, application-specific class data sharing, which is a feature of Hotspot that lets you load up a bunch of classes and then persist the in-memory data structures to a file, and then memory map that file in later for faster startup. So Jigsaw, we hope Jigsaw will bring some modest performance improvements in terms of startup time in JDK 9, and also that it will enable some more significant improvements, perhaps in 9, perhaps in 9 updates or future releases, or even products created outside of the JDK ecosystem.
Actually, just coming back to the startup being a little bit slower with the Jigsaw builds. Yes, it's a couple of milliseconds slower for things like Hello World. But if you even try it, even if you try the early access builds now with a long class path, put 500 jar files on your class path versus 500 modules versus LinkedIn, you'll actually see the difference in startup pretty quickly, because we've done quite a bit of benchmarking to understand that problem.
Yeah. We have a minute and a half left. The diabolical developer.
Diabolical developer. Thought he was on the banned list here. The banned row.
Hello, this is hopefully an easy one. I noticed there was a JEP where a new graphics renderer might be coming in for Java 2D to replace Pisces.
Yep,
and there was a really interesting little note which said Oracle may consider having this replacement also be the Oracle JDK's replacement for the 2D rendering, which would get OpenJDK even closer to being 100% of Oracle's JDK. Is that something you can comment on?
It's work in progress. I don't know where we are offhand with the state of evaluating it. Just as background for those who don't know, when Sun open sourced the JDK, we made the decision at that time to retain the proprietary renderer, which Sun had bought from some other company for use in the JDK in the early days. We made the decision to keep that because its quality was much higher than Pisces, which was the open source renderer that some Sun engineers and some people outside put together based on some open source code. And partly because there are customers who are extremely picky about how things are laid out and how fonts are rendered and how pixels appear, and we knew they would be upset if we just switched them over to Pisces. This new renderer, Marlin, does look a lot better. I know that some engineers in Oracle's graphics team are looking at it. They're helping with the integration. I don't know offhand where the evaluation is. I do agree it would be a good thing for Oracle to just not have this weird proprietary renderer anymore. So, all right, the monitor says time's up. Thank you very much.